You smell that? It smells like tea with a little sprinkling of salt. If I was more committed to that bit, I would have actual glitter, but I don't hate myself, I just hate these books. It's Leanne and welcome back to another video. A video in which I have tea, but I also have tea. On account of the fact that I also have some sort of fading festive lurgy. So if my voice takes on some pleasingly deep tones in this video, you're welcome. And if you spot that I'm a little snotty or look like I've just had a coughing attack, then no you didn't. It's all fine. Fine. It does, however, occur to me that this was the wrong mug to choose for this video because on the inside here it says, see the good things. But unfortunately today we're here only to see the bad things. Because this is indeed my worst books of 2023. And oh mama, there were a lot of them. 2023 was the year of changing reading habits for me. It was finally the year where I sat down with a project that allowed me to identify all of the weird and slightly problematic habits that I have surrounding my reading. Because where would a neurospicy person be without weird hang-ups that they've created for themselves? Richer, that's what they would be. Richer without all of the therapy. And so I don't think that it's any coincidence that in a year where I started to look at my reading with a microscope, where I discovered that I have a tendency to hold on to 3-star books, even though I know they're only going to be 3 stars, they're never going to get any better. That in a year where I discovered that predominantly I am reading not the books that I am most anticipating and most excited for, but instead the books that I think that I should be reading. In a year where I have discovered that I am not allowing myself to just submerge myself into my favourite series and read them through start to finish, for fear that I'm not getting to enough of my other books or talking about a variety of books. It should come as no surprise that in a year like that with all of those discoveries, I also hit the most DNFs that I have ever had in a single year. In 2023, I read 104 books, which is more books than I have ever successfully read and tracked the reading of in a year. And I tracked the DNFs of 53. Now I know for a fact that there are a few books that didn't actually make it onto my DNF spreadsheet this year because I DNF'd them so early that I was just like, ugh, get out of my life. So that number could be just a little bit higher. And those DNFs ranged this year between books that I had read like 15 pages off, 50 pages off, sometimes 150 pages off, which had an interesting effect on my worst books of 2023 list because a third of these books are books that I read early on in the year and I finished. I went all the way through, even though I knew I was not going to rate them highly in the end. And the other 2/3 of this list are books that I DNF'd because I recognise that I shouldn't be spending my time on them. And by the end of this video, I suspect that several of you will also not be spending your time on them. But conversely, I'm also sure that there's a few of you who are going to listen to some of the descriptions of the books that are on this list and be like, that's for me. Which is the beauty of worst books videos, my friends. Because, put quite simply, not everything is for you. These books on this list were not for me. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be for somebody else. I mean, I don't really know for who, but they might make somebody else very happy. Now, in past years, I have arranged this video in a variety of different ways. Sometimes I have ranked the worst books from number 10 to number 1. 10 being, it was fine, 1 being it committed the most egregious of all book sins. And in other years, I've just gone through them by date and order that I read them in. This year, however, I have a fun grouping system for you guys. You see, when you start tracking and analysing your book stack, certain themes begin to emerge. So for this time around, I have 4 separate categories that we are going to be perusing. And the first of those categories is catfished, because that is exactly what these books did to me. From the covers to the synopsis to the marketing, and in some cases even down to the genre in which these books were shelved. They promised me one thing and they turned out to be very much not that thing, like an anti-synopsis. The first of those books, and perhaps the one that I am the most salty about in this category, is How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, otherwise known as my very last shot at Grady Hendrix. Every single freaking time I pick up a Grady Hendrix book, I'm like, oh, sounds like it will be amazing. The original, darling. And every time it is lies. And not just small lies, but like living a double life with somebody else for 20 odd years kind of lies. Big catastrophic dream killing lies. I love the synopsis of Grady Hendrix books. Whoever is writing his synopsis needs a raise. Give that person a book contract because clearly they are well versed in fiction. Because not only was this not a book about how to sell a haunted house, in fact I would would argue that it wasn't even really a haunted house book in and of itself. But also, this one commits the Grady Hendrix sin of taking characters which seem perfectly normal and logical characters at the beginning and then having them make a bunch of decisions that I do not understand. Strange decisions that just make no sense. It's like somebody came to a D&D group with a fully filled out, fleshed out character sheet which looks great on the surface. Then by episode 3 of that campaign, nothing on that character sheet applies to anything that is going on. And unfortunately, I would also say that with every Grady Hendrix book that I have picked up, his writing has got worse. Or that instead of dropping red herrings and giving hints, he spells out every single thing that's happening on the page to you like you hadn't managed to make that leap in your brain. And yet, despite all of this, I had to give myself a firm talking to. I had to be like, you are not buying any more Grady Hendrix books. I absolutely 100% know the next time a Grady Hendrix book comes out with a fabulous cover and a great synopsis, my hand's going to be hovering over that pre-order button, knowing that I'm going to be disappointed but wanting to click on it anyway. Interestingly enough, the next 2 books in this catfished category are also kind of haunted things. The next one up is episode 13 by Craig DeLue, which was a book that I picked up for my Seance Society book club over on Patreon, and this one promised everything that I have ever wanted from a haunted house novel. Everything in this was set up so that I would absolutely love it, and what makes me so much more angry about this one is that at the beginning it was delivering exactly what it said it was going to. It was so engaging and it was so creepy that a couple of times I was like, ugh. And you know that that's what I'm looking for in my haunted house books. But then somehow we hit the halfway mark, and instead of haunted house things, we ended up somehow somewhere else, somewhere in like speculative sci-fi with portals to other dimensions and stuff, with a little flavour of early 1970s Cerebro from X-Men and all of the experiments that they did on Weapon X. And as soon as that happened, somehow the writing also became like, oh, gasp! We have found this alarming thing! Whatever shall we do about it? And all the complexity of these characters and their backstories just fell away in favour of telling a story which nobody signed up to. And to say that I and all of my patrons were disappointed is somewhat of an understatement. But maybe there was something in the water of 2023, because the next book that I have to talk about on this list was actually the first book that I picked up this year. This is Several People Are Typing by Calvin Kasulke. The premise of this one in a nutshell is that one of the employees of this very small advertising agency has been sucked into their Slack chat and is stuck there. This was a book that I read a few pages of in Waterstones when I was out with a friend, and that friend subsequently bought that book for themselves and then sent me a copy of it so that we could read it together, and we were both loving it and very surprised that at the 1/3 mark suddenly there was a queer plotline, and it was so subtly introduced and so cleverly done that I was like, wow, I am starting off 2023 with a book that I know is going to be amazing. I am going to get to the end of this and I am going to absolutely rave about this book. And then the not only dubious but extremely not okay consent stuff entered the chat. No pun intended, it literally did enter the chat. So if you don't want any spoilers about this book, then skip along until it's no longer on the screen, because the next little set of things that I want to tell you are huge spoilers but also massive warning labels in my particular opinion. The thing that really screwed me up about this book was that the person who had been sucked into the Slack chat's body was just kind of lying in their apartment. They eventually got someone to go around and to, you know, kind of maintain their body. The person could conveniently get them to eat and drink a little bit, and so, you know, they were not completely not there, but their consciousness was stuck in the Slack chat. However, at some point or another, the consciousness of the Slack chat itself, or the metaverse of the Slack chat, had become a sentient being, and it ended up in that person's body. And from then on, the Slack chat in that person's body went on to do a bunch of things with their body which was extremely objectionable, the worst of which being that the person who was caretaking them and the person who had actually fallen in love with them, the other half of the queer plotline, ended up having sex with the person's body, knowing that it was not the person in it and knowing that it was instead the Slack chat, and knowing that the person would have no idea that they had done this with their body. And if you struggled to follow that, then you weren't the only one. The headline of it is, "That is assault." And the way that it gets explained away on the page is extremely alarming. And all in all, I came to the end of this one and was like, I don't know what I just read, but I wish that I hadn't. And then finally in this category, we get to a fantasy book. This is The Helm of Midnight by Marina J. Lostetter, I think. And the reason that this one is in the catfish category is because it tried to do so very many things and it achieved approximately none of them. This one is trying to be a fantasy set in a French inspired world, but actually it's mostly just a kind of very thinly veiled alternative history France. Slightly different names for everything, including the nobility and the French Revolution. It's also trying to be one of those fantasy ensemble books wherein you get a bunch of roguish characters who are all a little bit morally grey. Like one of those books that kind of holds you at bay knowing there's more going on behind these characters that you're going to find out in the future. Except instead what it gave me was kind of like a complicated sisterly relationship which didn't really make any sense from the immediate outset, especially not from like a kind of military standpoint, which is also what this book is trying to serve you. It's trying to serve you like knights of the realm in this historical French setting with these complicated characters, but they're actually just sisters who don't like each other and would never really be in that position in any organisation worth its salt. But on top of that, it has like 3 separate magic systems. First, there's this set of magic beads which can be enchanted to do a bunch of different things, like give you less fear and more courage in a situation, but also which can be used to talk like walkie-talkie fashion because they're hanging on strings next to these knights' faces and they like and everybody else around them can hear what they're saying. A fact which I still hold is one of the grossest and weirdest things that I've ever read in a fantasy novel. Just this like drooly, spitty string of beads hanging by your face, getting like flicked in and out of your blah. No. Also, we then have a magic which allows objects to be imbibed with the souls of dead people because there's a death mask which gets stolen in the first couple of chapters of this book. And honestly, that is just a shaving off the top of what is going on in this because there are so many other facts dropped in at the very beginning of this book. And I put it in the catfish category because the synopsis has absolutely nothing to do with what the book is about. It was like the author wanted to write 5 different kinds of books and couldn't decide which one they wanted to settle on, so they just crammed all of them into the one thing and just called it good. But it wasn't good. It was the exact opposite of good, and I really hated it. Next up, we have a category of books which I am going to spend far less time on. In fact, I am going to spend exactly as much time on this category as any of these books individually deserves. This category is very aptly named Written with a Penis. There was no upper brain action going on there. There was only penis. Just right there on the page for you to read. And no, none of the books in this category are in fact smexy books. When I say written with a penis, what I mean is that you can absolutely 100% tell without any cover, synopsis or author bio that this book has been written by a cisgendered straight man. And the first of those books is You Should Have Left by Daniel Kelman, which I should have left on the shelf. A joke which I made in the original video, but still bears repeating. This book is essentially a massive knockoff of The Shining, except it has arguably more objectionable content in it than a lot of King's novels put together. And considering Stephen King's views in the 80s which bled into his books, that should give you a rough idea of what the male protagonist in this book thinks about everybody, but especially about women. This book is essentially Guy needs to write another throwaway screenplay, so takes his family, being his wife and very small daughter, to a very remote German cabin, wherein he spends the entire time not writing that script, which by the way is a silly romantic comedy for women that he just can't be bothered writing. And while he is spending his time not writing that, he is instead spending his time torturing his wife. Because I think that the author thought that they were doing a very clever thing with this, being like, oh, look how terribly this man treats his wife, but in the end he misses his wife when she goes missing and he tries to save his little girl, so surely that's like a full redemption arc, look at how clever I am. And instead all that comes across on the page is the author's attitudes to women. He's constantly dismissive, rude, reductive and outright hostile to his wife, and then when we discover halfway through this extremely tiny novel that she has had an affair, although of course her emotions are never actually given any room on the page to breathe, so I have no idea what the author thought her intentions were except for being a terrible adulteress. When he finds out that she's had an affair, he essentially is like, right, well the kid is mine and you can go to hell. Despite the fact that for the entire book, anytime this poor little child is on the page, it's told to go away, shut up, be quiet, stop interrupting dad. She's only ever described as good when she's in a corner not being perceived. It is the actual worst. And it is so tiny. I cannot believe how many truly objectionable things that the author managed to cram into such a small space. And honestly, you know how I mentioned at the beginning of this video that worst books videos are sometimes where I find some of my favourite books. This is not one of those books. This is one of those books that I kind of wish I had recycled instead of donating, because the attitudes in it are just so gross. Next up in this category, I have Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro, a book which was sold to me as being a kind of Victorian take on X-Men. We have children with supernatural abilities who are being like scooped up and taken away to a school in Scotland where they can be safe and not hunted, and they can use their abilities and learn things about themselves and stuff. That was what the synopsis sold to me, and technically that is what the book does, and that's why it's not also in the catfished category. But mostly what this book does is serve really gross and graphic depictions of violence against women right from the very first page, because the character that we are introduced to for the first extremely long chapter of this extremely long book is a woman who solely exists to make a baby so that we can follow the baby's journey on later. And in that chapter, she is put through so much abuse at the hands of men, both physical and sexual. And at the end of this chapter, there is an extremely graphic miscarriage scene which is dealt with in the space of one very tiny paragraph. And then that woman is sent off into the night because the baby that she stole earlier on in the chapter turns out to have a crazy level of power that she can't handle, and so she abandons it there in a hostel and takes off. And the tone is very judgmental about this. The tone is very much like, look at all of the things that she went through, isn't she a bad person? The only reason why I continued past that chapter was because I was listening to an audiobook and I didn't actually have the ability to turn it off because I was driving, which meant that I had to listen to the start of the next chapter, which had some extremely questionable ways of portraying black characters on the page. I have not heard a single person say anything good about this book since it came out. I have heard a bunch of other reviews from people that I trust where they DNF'd this one halfway through. So make of that what you will. Next up, we have The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. This was my first and very last Chuck Wendig. When I picked this up, I was like, I can't believe that I haven't tried anything by this author before because they are so prolific in the horror genre, but something in my brain should have been doing the like alarm bell system at that point, because quite frankly, the horror genre has a lot of catching up to do with the rest of publishing in terms of like contemporary attitudes to the things that it is writing about. And as a sweeping statement, male authors who have vast backlists tend to have at some point or other jumped into a lot of the very popular 80s fantasy tropes, which is things like homophobia, violence against women, casual violence for the sake of casual violence, and slasher horror or body gore in a way that doesn't actually add anything to the text. So in short, not my kind of horror, and I should maybe have picked up on that before I bought this book. And realistically, this book could also have been in the catfish category, because on the back of this book it says that a young couple from this very small town who both really escaped their horrible childhoods have decided now that they have a child that they're going to move back and they're going to try and make the best of a bad situation and reclaim some things about their childhood, and that their child then gets haunted by the ghost of another child in this town. And so many things are a big fat lie about this, because they don't move back to make the best of anything. They move back because in the very first chapter they are given a massive house and a huge bit of land because one of the characters' relatives have died. So they move back because they've hit the jackpot, not because they want to tenderly like fix their souls. And the little kid is not in fact a little kid, they are in fact a teenager, and they aren't haunted so much as they choose to befriend something because they are themselves a little bit of a shithead. But in the first 30 pages of this book, not only does it tell you that its synopsis is a complete lie, but also we then jump into the execution of a serial killer, and that serial killer comforts himself on his way to the electric chair by being like, haha, you don't know the total of how many women I have actually brutally murdered. Let me just go to my happy place and think about that for a little while. And on the page, we are in that serial killer's head. So we're also kind of seeing him self-pleasure himself with the thought of these women who he has like horribly killed as we are watching him be horribly killed. And the next scene after that is a hunting scene with a vast amount of graphic detail, not only about the hunting but also about how the person who is the hunter is killed. And quite honestly, if you had told me that this was actually physically written with a penis, I would not have been surprised. The next category that I have is simply called They Talked a Big Game. Each of the 4 books on this list talked an amazing game about what it was going to give to the reader, and they took those big swings and made big misses. Like horrifically big misses. The first of these books is The Companion by E.E. Ottoman. This is an indie book, something which I picked up more of in 2023 than I ever have before. And this one is marketed as a poly romance about a girl who's trying to make it big in New York, and I think like the 30s or 40s, as a writer, but she's not managing it and she's run out of money, and her friend puts her in touch with a very, very famous author who needs a companion in his big rambling house. When she goes to stay with him, a poly relationship between him, her and his neighbour starts to happen. Except this book just served nothing. There was no atmosphere, there was nothing in any of the characters for me to actually latch onto and care about. It was all style over substance. Like when the main character got to this famous author's house, she walks through it and the descriptions in the book should have been making everything in me happy tingle. These rooms were very like bohemian, they'd been taken over by plants, there were tons of half-written pieces of paper on the floor, there were like pens everywhere from where the author had clearly like put himself in the best sunlight in order to write and then abandon stuff. It all felt very like chic and like it should be making me feel like, oh, I can't wait to meet him. And instead it was just really hollow. It was like somebody had explained to an illustrator exactly what they wanted that illustrator to draw without there being any heart and soul, because you're expecting it to be in a picture that people can see and be like, ooh, but it wasn't a picture, it was words, and I needed more from the words and it just wasn't there. There was no soul in this book. And that, coupled with a massive amount of insta love, a relationship which I did not believe right from the start, make it too long for what it was, and realistically this is a short novel, this could even be called a novella, and it was still too long. And then unfortunately litter that with a bunch of typos and repeated words, which had this just gone to another editor, had this just gone to anybody to read it through before it was published, I think it would have been easy to pick up, and you got this like really complicated, really sad mess of a book. And I am genuinely really sad about this one because I would love to read some good poly romances, but I just keep finding duds. The next book on this list is They Came to Slay by Tom James Carter, which is a 404 Inklings book, which is very small, kind of like introductions to certain topics, published by a small publisher in Scotland. I have previously absolutely adored some of their titles. Some of their books have just been absolutely mind-boggling. This book was just not it. This is supposed to be a history of queerness in the D&D universe, which is like an extremely rich and vibrant topic, but also like kind of taboo and barrier breaking. And this book was exactly like reading an undergraduate essay, where in the first introduction we were told what the book was going to do, then we were given a topic, and at the end of that topic we summed up what we'd already told you in the topic, and then the outro of this book was just summing up everything we'd already told you in the book so that you know what the essay was supposed to do, which is every undergrad essay that has ever existed. It was extremely badly structured, and it was weirdly proportioned in terms of like what it focused on and what areas. There was quite a lot of time given to very small topics that I didn't really care very much about, but there wasn't a lot of expansion on the topics that I was really, really interested in. And it felt like that was primarily because the author didn't have a lot of access to interview a lot of the people who would have given the information to make this book a little bit meatier. And on top of all of that, it employed this weird structure in a couple of different places where the author presented this to you as if they were a dungeon master and they were explaining how the world worked to you, which is a really clever premise in theory, but unfortunately what they were explaining to you was Earth and how Earth happens. Like they literally introduce you to planet Earth and humans, and I don't need to know that because I live here and am a human, and I really felt like this was a massive miss. I would love to read another book on this subject, but I would love to read a book that's like 300 pages and very well researched and filled with interviews and snippets from people's campaigns and like stuff from actual queer D&D players themselves, instead of just one person's like really narrow view on the subject. Next up we have The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackworth, which has the dubious honour of being the book which put me into the biggest reading slump of 2023. This was a book that I'd had on my shelf for a really long time because I was absolutely sure I was going to love it. It was a rainy day book in the extreme, and I made myself pick it up, I think for Mixtapeathon, because usually I don't pick up a rainy day book unless there's an actual readathon Amazon prompt to do so. But unfortunately, when I picked it up, it was so very much not what it promised it was going to be. And not in the catfish way, but in like the enjoyment level way, that I was so shocked because I was so sure this was going to be 5 stars. I was so sure this was going to be the start of me reading another completed series. And because I was so unwilling to let go of it, it just kept making me not read. Like, I knew that I should be reading, but I didn't want to pick this up, but I didn't want to move on from this book because I knew I was never going to go back to it. And so I just kept being in this cycle of like picking up, reading a couple pages, putting it down and being angry about it. In the Discworld, we have Death, who is an anthropomorphized being, so he has his own thoughts and feelings, and he lives in his own little kind of constructed realm outside of where humans can see him. And this was essentially exactly that. This was about a character called Claire who worked in Hell's Library, which is a library of like half-written books, and occasionally a hero or heroine will escape from a book and make it back to its author in the real world, and it's Claire's job to stop that from happening. And there was kind of like a little hint somewhere that Claire was not quite under Death's control in the same way as everybody else was, and so Death, or the devil in this world, and Claire had an interesting relationship, and I was like super excited for all of that, but it just fell so flat. Claire was a character exactly like the Nikki French female characters that I read last year that I hated, who was like meant to be really strong, meant to be really cool, meant to be really like different from other girls, but instead she was actually just mean, cold and standoffish. She kept saying these like really deeply sarcastic things, and they were meant to come off as this really like funny, like, oh my god, I can't believe she said that about the devil, girl, but instead they just made her look a bit like an asshole. Like, she was massively aloof, but for no particular reason that anybody could put their finger on. There was one character in this who I was extremely excited to read from until I discovered that she was essentially just there for window dressing. Like, she was that character in an urban fantasy novel who has pink hair and chews chewing gum, who's into like sci-fi stuff and is a little bit quirky and weird, and that was all that that character had about them. And I'm so sad about this one. I'm so sad about it because the whole setup was so good. The premise is so good, but the execution is so bad. And then finally, the last book on this list is A Certain Kind of Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. This is the first sort of straight up thriller book on this list, and the reason that there aren't many thrillers on this list is because I made much better choices in 2023 about reading thrillers, which means that I read less of them. Like, I read in percentage in 2023 fewer thrillers than I have read in any other year, and that is because I've got very good at looking at the premise of a thriller and being like, this is a cookie cutter thriller, I am not interested, or I know that this thriller is going to do this thing with the twist and I don't want to read that because I've already read it before and I didn't like it. And unfortunately, I think that says quite a lot about the thriller genre right now, as it was one of those genres that in the last couple of years had like a massive renaissance and everybody was like really excited for it, and that meant that publishing was pushing out masses and masses of thrillers which were the same as all the other thrillers because that's how they identify trends. And this one definitely falls into that category because it is another one of those woman is a surprise serial killer books. But unlike the first Sweet Pea book, not the series, don't get it twisted, the first Sweet Pea book, and books like Jane Doe, which do this premise really well, where they complexly show you a character who is deeply flawed, this was another one of those thrillers with a main character who is extremely self-satisfied with herself, and the author appears to think that the character that they've written is the cleverest character that has ever existed. This character is so full of herself, like she believes all of her own hype and her own mystique, and I was so over her from like page 5. It's another one of those thrillers that's trying to be shocking by portraying a woman as like kind of pointing the finger at society and you as a reader, like you're the problem that you don't like this character. It's trying to provide not only a thriller but also a social commentary at the same time, and it's just not doing it. Because the thing about books like Sweet Pea and Jane Doe is that they are not just providing you with a character who is quite objectionable and who is doing something very outside of society and who's also doing something surprising for a cisgendered woman, which is being a serial killer, as we know that those are predominantly male orientated things. But they're providing you with this character while allowing the character to have vulnerability. The first page of these books, you don't get told like this is a very cool serial killer character and she doesn't have any time for you, and that's very much what this book does, and I am over it because it is hot garbage. And then finally we have the last two books on this list, which are in a category entitled So Bad That They Deserved Their Own Category, and there's only two of them. There's only two books that were objectionable enough to me that they ended up in this category, and the first of those is The Roommate by Rosie Danan. This was one of the most recommended books which you guys told me that I should read, and I did. And now I need to know what's wrong with y'all. Premise of this book, you are right, is perfect for me. The premise of this book is amazing. It is about two characters who are very much not in each other's worlds, who get thrown together in a roommate situation. They're living in the same apartment, and I absolutely love that. I love forced proximity. I love two completely different people having to work out how to live with each other. It's why found family sci-fi stories work for me so well, because everybody's crammed on a spaceship usually and there's literally nowhere to go. I wanted to love this so incredibly badly, but there were so many things wrong with this book, and I'm kind of concerned that so many people love this book way. So on actually reading this book, the main character is not just leaving for a new start in California, she's actually running away from her entire life to move in with a guy who is an ex-boyfriend who has absolutely no idea that she would like him to be a current boyfriend again. She brings with her all of the memorabilia of their relationship, which she then, in a scene when he's no longer there, lays out on her bed, kind of like a serial killer would lay out trophies, and looks at all of the individual things that she's got that reminds her of their relationship, including apparently a food item that was frozen when she left but is of course not frozen in her luggage now and is just in a sad little drippy Ziploc bag. And when she gets there and the ex-boyfriend has actually gone on a road trip and has left her in this apartment with a guy that she's never met, with a roommate that she just left with, her reaction to this is to try and make order from the chaos, which again, that was something that I really enjoyed. I genuinely enjoyed her being like, okay, but I want it to be like this, and him being like, okay, well princess, that's not how life works, you can't just push people into the boxes you want them to be in. But then that attitude goes from, okay, I want it to work this way, it doesn't work this way, he's saying it has to work this way, into straight up gaslighting. And within the first 40 pages, he has already shamed her about the fact that she's a virgin and the fact that she doesn't watch any of these adult entertainment videos, and has her doubting herself so much that she's eventually like, okay, I'm gonna look them up, I'm gonna see what this is all about. And when she does look up those videos, he of course, this book is full of conveniences, he walks in on her while she is watching his videos, and while she is lying on the couch in a little nightie where you can kind of see everything, and she's leaning into the idea of having a little bit of fun with herself on the back of watching these videos, and he just stands there and watches her. He does not tell her that he is there, he does not alert her to his presence at all, he just enjoys her watching him. That is beyond red flag behaviour. That's leaning into the this is assault area. And from that scene where he walks in on her in this vulnerable position, he essentially coerces her into having sex with him to get over this weird virginal state that she's in. And then afterwards he's like, okay, that meant nothing. Peace, enjoy. And guys, I have so many questions about why anybody thinks that's okay. And then finally there was the scene which just ended it all for me, which just made me feel so furious. And that is the scene where the two of them went to the grocery store and he's putting Cheetos and stuff like that into the cart, and she's hard judging him for all of the disgusting sinful food that he is eating. All of this how does he possibly maintain this body while he eats this terrible crap? And she puts in one tub of Greek yogurt and a salad, and she's like, that'll do me for the week. At least I've got this very skinny body, at least I am clearly still this slim and I can own this about myself. But she is of course skinny with massive boobs and a big ass, because of course she is. And I was done. I was so done with the food shame, the lack of consent, and the just straight up grossness of the way that he looked at her. I don't understand why anybody likes this book, and I kind of want to burn it. I'm not gonna lie. I kind of want to actually burn it. And then finally, the last book on this list is one of the last books that I DNF'd for 2023, and so really there's nothing to kind of like knock it off this dubious top slot. I mean, I haven't ranked any of the books this year. This definitely wouldn't be in my #1 slot for like my most hated book of the year. It is definitely up there. And that book is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. I knew when I talked about this in my last tops and bottoms that this was going to be an unpopular opinion, but what I didn't realise when I mentioned it was how many people were actually going to agree with me. I will say that not only for me did this book not only not deliver what it promised to deliver, but what it did deliver was kind of just like an unrecognisable mishmash of lots of different elements from lots of different genres with extremely overwritten descriptive scenes that did nothing for the actual plot. So this book was essentially marketed as a dark academia wherein the main character is an architect. She is in college studying that when a competition comes up one day to design a house for one of the estates of her favourite writer ever. That was the premise. The book is not about that premise. This is a dark academia novel which is at once trying to serve you like a 1930s, 1940s atmosphere whilst also trying to serve you a straight up high fantasy, and it is doing neither of those things in any kind of substantial way. What this book is actually about is a world that is at war, and this particular city that this character goes to school in is between these two warring nations, and I could never understand whether these warring nations were city-states or countries and what kind of border this was, but for whatever reason this city sits in the middle of these two warring peoples, and in this city it's kind of quite peaceful. It's like a neutral zone even though it's in the middle of these two warring entities, and the peoples from both of these countries kind of mix together there, although she very much keeps to her own kind. And in this world there is a bunch of magic which is never really completely explained, except that we have essentially saints who are preserved but not alive, but also kind of alive, who are living in glass coffins who are not decaying in any way, and those glass coffins are just in like a library slash museum down the street which you can go and look at any point, even though they are living mystical beings. Meanwhile, in the dark academia atmosphere of this college, we have got this girl running about in tweed and being very like sad and soft and floaty and dreamy. There's a lot of descriptions about the way that the light hits her hair. There's a lot of descriptions of how everybody in this college hates her because she's also the only girl in this college, and she's chosen to come here because her grades were just so good. They were the best in the entire world, and she had her choice of where she wanted to go, so she came here. She doesn't understand why everybody hates her, and it is very much just like poor me, woe is me, to the point where this character goes to the library to take out books on this dead writer, and when she gets there all of the books have been taken out of the library by the one student in this entire college who comes from the other side of the divide, and she basically runs out of the library like, oh, all the books have gone, nobody could have predicted that. And I do just want to briefly address something here, and that is that while I am critiquing the way that this character behaved, I am in no way saying that every female character in the world needs to be like kick-ass and strong and like a hard-nosed fantasy character. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. I am not coming in expecting any character in any book to completely have their shit together, because what would be the point in reading about them if that was the case? So when I am critiquing this character, I am in no way critiquing the fact that she is not like emotionally solid. I am, however, critiquing the fact that she seems to be just made up of dreamy looks and tears, where the only thing that this character has is her helplessness and her like inability to solve any of her own issues or have any kind of agency about her situation. She just exists to be like depressed and mopey and moody until the right romance comes along to solve all of that for her. And as I said in my tops and bottoms, this was not my first Ava Reid book, and I came into this with my eyes wide open, expecting this book to serve me nothing but vibes. I was expecting this book to be a candy floss book, but it wasn't. There were no vibes, there was only confusion, and once again I think too many things shoved into a very small space, and none of them ended up being completely realised concepts. So that is it, guys. I kind of can't believe that we are here at the end of this video. My best and worst videos feel like benchmarks every year, and every year I'm kind of like, how are we here? So if you have got this far through this video, I want you to leave me an emoji which describes your worst book of 2023. And with that emoji, I also want you to tell me what that book was. Please tell me about the book that did you the worst damage in 2023. The book that you wish you could have returned for your money back. The book that you know you will never get the mental time back from. And as always, please tell me if you have read any of the books on this list and whether you similarly hated them or absolutely loved them and think that I am serving slander in this video. And as always, if any of you have any recommendations for books that I might actually like based on any of the books in this video, I would really enjoy those. And I will be back very soon with my best books of 2023, because contrary to popular belief, I swear there are lots of them. I'll speak to you soon, guys. Bye!